Welcome to the Science for the Public lecture series. Science for the Public is an organization committed to bringing science information and issues to the general public. Visit our website for our program listings and blog. Good evening. This is Science for the Public. I'm Yvonne Stapp, and welcome tonight to Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. Tonight, Richard Primack is a professor of biology at Boston University. He received his PhD from Duke University in 1976 and has since built a long and distinguished academic career which is comprehensive in scope. For example, plant populations and rare plant species, tropical forest ecology and conservation, the loss of species in protected areas, and biological impacts of climate change are particular focus tonight. Dr. Primack has served as a visiting professor at the University of Hong Kong and at Tokyo University, and he's been awarded Bullard and Putnam Fellowships from Harvard University and a Guggenheim Fellowship also. He was president of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation and is currently editor-in-chief of the journal Biological Conservation. Some more than 27 foreign language editions of his textbooks have been produced with something quite unique, local co-authors adding in local examples, which he'll talk about tonight. He's an author of rainforest books also, and he's currently writing a popular book about changes in Concord, Massachusetts since the time of Henry David Thoreau and Walden. Dr. Primack's distinctions are very extensive. We therefore refer you to his page on the Science for the Public website for additional information. And meanwhile, we are very honored to welcome Professor Richard Primack. Welcome, sir.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Yes. And I'd like to start off with a little bit of general background. You've been all over the globe and seen climate change. Could you say when you noticed a real distinction, and is there any region that you would cite as particularly affected?
Well, in order to detect the fingerprint of climate change, one of the best ways of doing it is to find historical records of when things happened in the past, the timing of past events, which is what we call phenology in this area of research. And it turns out that the Boston area is uniquely suited to this kind of work because we have such a rich heritage of naturalist and scientific institutes and colleges and universities in this area. So we started looking for this information in 2003. And as soon as we started looking, we started finding the evidence of climate change. So at this point, actually, the Boston area is probably as well documented as any area in the United States, and is one of the best areas also in the world for climate change research.
That's quite interesting. I don't think we're aware that we think that we're out there in front all the time anyway in Massachusetts,
Well,
but here we are in climate change. Here we are in climate change. Exactly. In your work with looking at climate change, but also ecosystems, which I'd like you to explain, if you would, to us a little bit, you have emphasized, and again, it seems quite uniquely, individuality of some of these ecosystems that the rest of us kind of merge together, like tropical rainforests or something. Could you give us a little explanation of ecosystem and then this individuality that you worked on?
Okay, well, up until about 20 years ago, people mostly talked about biological communities. So all the plants and the animals and the fungi living together in one place were called the biological community. But now people often use this term ecosystem to mean also the chemical and physical interactions of that biological community. So how the biological community absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, how it translates sunlight and water into producing new plant tissue, and also how it traps rainwater and then gradually releases it as pure water into our rivers and lakes. So all these kind of more encompassing processes of a biological community we now call an ecosystem. So it's a bit more of a comprehensive terminology, and also emphasizes the role that these ecosystems play in sort of human affairs. And so we have worked on tropical ecosystems, particularly in Malaysia, on the island of Borneo. But then beginning around 9 years ago, my students and I decided to focus on the Boston area, so on our forests and fields in the Boston area, to see if we could see the effects of climate change on the ecosystems of this particular region.
And
what did we find?
yeah.
So again, as soon as we started looking, there are lots of different potential effects of climate change on biological communities or ecosystems. And the ones that we're most concerned about probably are things like the loss of species, so how rare and endangered species decline because of warming temperatures and drier conditions in the summertime. We might be concerned with forest health. So for example, if the conditions get warmer and there's outbreaks of insects, how this will cause our forests to start dying, resulting in loss of timber and loss of water quality in this region. But of all these characteristics of ecosystems, the one that we can actually detect the first is on the timing of events. So all these other events are linked together, but the first one that we will actually see the effects of for climate change is the timing of when plants flower and when they leaf out, or when birds start migrating in the spring, or when butterflies start flying. And so we've really focused on these timing events. And we found lots of evidence. Whenever we've looked, we have always found the evidence of timing. And the effects of timing is strongest in the case of plants. So plants are very, very responsive to temperature. So plants are now flowering and leafing out anywhere from 10 days to 2 weeks earlier than in Thoreau's times. And birds are also changing as well, but probably only on the order of a couple of days earlier since Thoreau's times. And insects are really still the unknown of this subject area. For a long time, we thought that there was actually no insect data out there. We were searching intensively for information about insects, and we thought that nobody had really been following insects very closely. And only in the last 1 or 2 years, we've started to discover bodies of data about insects, and that's really a very intensive area of investigation right now.
And that may account for why there is some substantial damage with trees in various parts of the country and so forth too, because of the warmer climate or
that's right.
Whatever.
So insects are very strongly controlling plant populations in many areas of the country. And so as conditions get a little bit warmer, a lot of insects, instead of dying off during the winter, wind up surviving either completely or just better, and that results in insect outbreaks. This is a very big problem with beetles in the western United States. They're killing huge areas of pine trees. And in the Massachusetts or the New England area, warmer temperatures really facilitate the development of this one particular insect called the woolly adelgid, which is really attacking the hemlock trees in this area very strongly. But that's true of a lot of other insects as well, which are forest pests. That as conditions get warmer, we're going to be expecting more pest outbreaks and damage to trees.
Okay. Can I take you back just for a minute? I ask you about the individual systems, ecosystems that you had focused on in the past. Do you mind if I just shift you a little bit to the tropical work a little bit, which we don't really hear a whole lot about, and we're going to spend some time on the Massachusetts thing shortly. But could I just ask about that, the individuality of these systems, like the tropical rainforest systems? Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Well, Boston, again, has a very unique role to play, because in most areas of the United States, when people talk about the tropical rainforest, they're mostly talking about rainforests in the Americas, either the Caribbean or Central America or Brazil. But in the Boston area, Boston has always had this interesting focus on a more international perspective, and also particularly a focus on Asia. There's been a long association of Boston with Asian interests. And in the Boston area, many of the tropical biologists in the Boston area work in Asia, work in India or Malaysia, Indonesia, or other countries. And so as a result, when I started working in Malaysia, I was constantly reacting to biologists from elsewhere in the United States who were talking about the tropical rainforest, because the rainforests in Southeast Asia are not like the forests in the American tropics. And so it made me thinking about how those forests in Asia are different from the Americas, and also how they're different from rainforests in Africa and Madagascar. So I began to decide to develop this as a subject, and I wound up writing a book with a colleague of mine, Richard Corlett, and we wrote a book describing how rainforests in different parts of the world are actually totally different from one another. There isn't this one thing called the tropical rainforest. In fact, there are very different kinds of tropical forests on each continent, each one of which has its own unique characteristics.
Can you give us an example of something unique about A or B?
Oh, there's so many examples, but one example is that in the American tropics, there's fairly regular seasonality, so that plants flower and fruit on a fairly regular cycle, and the animals reproduce on a fairly regular annual cycle, depending on the cycles of drought and then monsoon. But in Southeast Asia, where I worked, there's typically rain almost all the time. It's almost always sort of rainy and hot and humid, and then once every 5 to 7 years, there's a period of drought, followed by a period of tremendous flowering and fruiting of the trees. So you don't have these annual cycles of flowering and fruiting. You in fact have these 5 to 7 year cycles of five years in which there's very little fruit and flowers in the forest, and suddenly a superabundance of flowers and fruits. So it's a very different biology, and it means that the animals there tend to be much larger in size because they have to be bigger to survive these long periods with less food, and they tend to reproduce on 5 to 7 year cycles rather than every 1 year cycle. So it's a very, very different biology in the forest there.
I can imagine insects adapting like that and so on.
That's
so
right.
they've just
all,
been...
all the animals are adapted to this very, very different sort of cycle of production of flowers and fruits.
Right. Just very quickly, you know, that's like an El Nino cycle as well. Does that have anything? Oh, it is. It follows the El Nino.
That's right. So it's linked to the El Nino cycle.
And all of these organisms apparently have learned to it, or a lot of them adapt, or they don't.
They have evolved to adapt to them. Otherwise, they would have died out.
That's quite interesting. That's right. As a biologist, could you say anything about relative fragility from one species to another? Do you know, is there some little gene out there that makes something more robust and adaptable? You probably observed this in your work, things that just aren't going to make it.
That's right. So in the work which we've been doing in the Boston area on climate change, well, first of all, the changes which are occurring in temperature and rainfall patterns are so rapid that species really have difficulty adapting evolutionarily. But what's happening is it's changing the species composition in this area. So what's happening is that we're seeing that a lot of the southern species which have more southern distribution, are tending to increase in the Boston area, and a lot of the cold adapted species of more northern distribution are tending to decline in abundance. And also invasive species are increasing in abundance. So the warm conditions particularly favor a lot of things like purple loosestrife or garlic mustard, which are really more warm adapted species. And so what we're seeing in Concord and really throughout the Boston area is a shift toward also particularly a greater percentage of invasive species, non-native invasive species, and a decreased percentage of native species. And the one group of native species that are really increasing are these sort of more southern species.
So the South is moving up here, is what you're telling us.
So what's happening is they're dying out here. So like in the Boston areas, the populations of northern species are dying out. They're surviving further north of here, and at the northern end of the range, they're sending their sort of propagules, their seeds and fruits in all directions, and the ones which go further north wind up establishing sort of new colonies. And what we don't see southern species arriving here yet. What we're really seeing is that the southern species that are already here are increasing in abundance. And what we suspect will be happening in future decades or centuries is, say, species which are presently in southern Connecticut or, say, in northern Virginia or New Jersey might eventually start arriving here and start becoming more common in this area.
Do you know, as southern species move upward, then that will shift our climate here, you know, dramatically? I assume, is that going to have a dramatic effect?
Well, the climate here is changing, but it's not changing because the species are moving here. It's changing because we're putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So because as long as we keep putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases, the conditions are going to continue to get warmer. It's probably going to change the rainfall patterns. We're going to have rising sea level, which is going to be flooding coastal areas of a lot of areas of Boston, that's right, the Fall River, or a lot of Cape Cod and the islands. So we're going to have these effects. And the plants and the animals and the fungi are all adapting to that. And to some extent, it'll be a sort of a positive feedback loop, because as conditions get drier, then the forests are going to start dying, they're going to be more susceptible to fire, and that will cause even more changes.
Yes.
So when a forest burns, then the ecosystem becomes even drier, and then becomes even more susceptible to further fire and to more drought-tolerant species. So we're going to have a lot of changes in coming decades. Again, the timing events is not the most significant biological event, but that's the one we can detect. It also, people need to be aware of that, because as people are seeing these sort of changes in the timing, the earlier timing of spring, that just tells them that climate change is a reality, and these other serious consequences like rising sea level, heat waves in the summertime, those are going to follow behind.
Okay. On that cheery note, tell us, if you will, is there anything, I think in Massachusetts, the level of consciousness, I think, is pretty high anyway, and people are concerned and want to do the right thing. What could citizens do the most that would be the most helpful, do you think?
Well, there's two things you can do. One important thing to do is if you're worried about there being too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, is just try to produce less, to drive less, use more public transportation, buy more fuel-efficient cars. You know, don't heat your house as warm in the wintertime. Don't use air conditioning as much in the summertime. But the other thing you can do is to pressure the political leaders, because we can only do so much as individuals. These changes in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere really have to be taken by national and even international efforts. So we really need to be pressuring the politicians. At the present time, it seems that the American public is convinced of the reality of climate change and even wants the political leaders to do something.
However,
but the public is not pressuring the public to actually do enough. And the political leaders will only react when they're being pressured by the public.
Okay, nobody leaves here tonight without writing a letter. So thank you for encouraging us to get out there and do the pressuring right. I'd like to shift now to your very interesting research interests, which are enormous. But could you give us a little background? The people can see that we have all of this production. This is just the textbooks that he's produced. So I want to do two things: to talk about your research interests, very interesting background, and then we'll go to the textbook thing, which is very innovative.
Okay.
If you would, please. So you have studied these ecosystems all over the world and so on. What's your favorite thing to study?
Well, of course, the most interesting thing for me is what's happening in Concord and Walden Pond.
I sensed that, yes.
Well, we actually started it 9 years ago, looking for whatever evidence we could find in the eastern Massachusetts area. And we found a lot of very interesting examples, particularly at the Arnold Arboretum, because they have a very rich record of historical information there. But within about 6 months of starting to look, in 2003, we discovered that Thoreau had made very detailed observations of when plants flowered in Walden Pond and around Concord. And these records were of over 300 plant species for when they flowered between 1851 and 1858, and that other naturalists in Concord have continued these kinds of observations that Thoreau had made. And these records were accessible to us, some of which were at the Concord Public Library. And so what we started doing, starting in 2004, was making our own very detailed observations of when plants flowered in Concord. And by using these records that Thoreau started and other people continued, and then we sort of started again over the last 8 years, we found that plants in Concord are now flowering much earlier than in the past. So this is a great example, because as far as we know, it's the longest running example of the timing of flowering anywhere in the United States. So it's the best example in terms of the number of species, or the combination of the number of species and the length of time, and that it's also associated with Thoreau and Walden. So it creates a lot of interest because people know about Thoreau, they know about Walden Pond, and so it really connects climate change to a body of literature and a historical figure that people already know about. So it's a great example.
Yeah, that is a very good example, but I learned, I guess, from your work that other people really carried on that task of watching these progressions, these seasonal changes over a long time, and you had this first-rate primary resource to do this work. So that's really very interesting. Is there any other area that you have just really enjoyed doing, has been especially interesting for you?
Well, in other areas, I was working at the Arnold Arboretum, because at the Arnold Arboretum, they have an enormous resource there in terms of not only the living collection, they have over 1,000 sort of plants growing there of trees, shrubs, and vines, but they also have an enormous museum collection where people have gone out and made museum specimens of the plants growing on the grounds of the Arboretum. And so using these museum specimens, you can actually see when plants flowered in the past. And what's so wonderful about that is that we've gone out there and recorded when all the plants are flowering and leafing out at the Arnold Arboretum. And so that's a wonderful experience. I don't like to just be one of these scientists that just stays in their office and sends out their students to do all the research. I like doing the work myself. So my students and I go out every spring and we record when the plants flower and leaf out at the Arboretum. But when we started to match these records of when plants are flowering and leafing out at the Arnold Arboretum now with when they flowered and leafed out in the past using these museum specimens, we found out that plants are also again flowering and leafing out much earlier than they did 50 or 100 years ago. And I still remember when we actually asked an undergraduate to sort of prepare a comparison of the historical specimens with the modern records. And she showed us this beautiful diagram showing that plants were now flowering much earlier than the past. And we thought she'd actually made a mistake because it showed so clearly the effects of change over time and the fact that plants flower earlier in warmer years than in colder years. And so I still remember that excitement when she showed us this diagram.
Just on that quickly, in case there's anybody still around who resists climate change, and there are some out there somewhere beyond Massachusetts borders, but in that case, that they would say, well, there have been these cycles throughout history, and there are these 5 to 7 year cycles also, but do you have grounds for saying, no, this is definitely due to this unique climate change that we have caused, when you look at these records? Well,
our research is really about just how warming temperature affects the flowering time of plants and the migration of birds. And actually, I should also, to be really very clear about this, that what we're seeing in the Boston area, about 1/3 of the warming has been about a 2 to 3 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature since Thoreau's time in the Boston area. About 1/3 of that is caused by global warming, and about 2/3 of that is caused by urbanization. So just when you urbanize an area, when you create more parking lots and buildings and roads and cut down the trees, it causes a lot of warming. So actually that makes Boston a great place to study climate change because it's had so much warming. But the reason that we know that this present warming trend is caused by human activity is because if you actually, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this sort of organization of the leading scientists in the world, have actually calculated that the warming that we've experienced is beyond what the normal fluctuations of the climate are due to natural processes. And if you actually include the effects of all the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it very accurately predicts the amount of warming that we've seen. So we're in a slight cooling right now because of the kind of the El Nino Southern Oscillation cycle, but within a couple of years it'll be even warmer. But even still, this year is still an extraordinarily warm year by historical standards.
Right.
So, you know, again, the leading scientists in the world tell us that the amount of warming we've seen is caused by this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
Right. And then there's a question of whether this is past some tipping point or whatever, but we won't go there for the moment. Instead, we'll shift to your wonderful project, your textbook project. Now, you've been a prolific writer, a prolific researcher, very comprehensive, and it is quite unique. In academia, a lot of people get extremely narrow. You've gone the other way. So it's a real gift to, say, students of biology. But I'd like to talk about some specific feature of your textbook. So your textbooks, a number of these, well, 2 or 3 of these are standard textbooks for conservation biology. And then in addition to that, you went another step. Would you tell us about this textbook project?
Okay. So in 1992 and 1993, I wrote this book, which is The Essentials of Conservation Biology. And after it came out, I thought it would be translated into lots of different languages. And it was translated very quickly into Chinese and German, but that was all. And I wondered why it wasn't being translated to other languages. And the reason for that is that people in other countries didn't know what conservation biology was because it's a relatively new field of biology. So I got this idea that instead of just waiting for foreign language publishers to approach my publisher and sort of suggest that maybe they would translate the book, what I would do is I would very actively seek out scientists from other countries, other languages, and I would invite them to translate the book and to put in examples from their own country, so the book would really be very suited to the local students or audience in that country, and that also that person, by putting in all that local content, would become a co-author. And actually a secret also is that this person would also become an advocate. So this person not only would be the co-author, but by having a local co-author in the country, they would advance the field of conservation biology or nature protection within the country. So as one example, I kept waiting for a French edition of my textbook, but it didn't appear. So I started just writing to French ecologists and conservation biologists, inviting them to work with me to produce a French edition. And eventually they put me in touch with two scientists at the University of Paris who teach a large course in conservation biology in the Paris area. And when I proposed to them the idea of doing this book, they were wildly enthusiastic. And so this book just came out a couple of weeks ago. It's the latest book. It's the 28th book.
Oh.
And so this is really, makes me quite happy.
I think.
So it has a lot of French content in it, examples from, France and former French colonies. Lots of nice color pictures.
That's interesting.
That's right.
Yes, that's very interesting. Good. What other languages and so on? And I want to point out to people, this is really extraordinary to go to this trouble to invite other authors from other countries and to look at flora and fauna at that local level. I don't think there is any other textbook out there, and this great big field.
I keep telling people about this idea.
Right, but it's a great idea.
So this one right here, this is the Czech edition, has a very beautiful cover. And so I was at a meeting of the International Congress of Ecology about 10 years ago, and there was this sort of shy man off by himself, didn't seem to have many friends, and so I went and talked to him just to be kind of kind, discovered that he was one of the very few Czech scientists at this meeting. And so after talking with him for a while, I suggested, why doesn't he translate my book into the Czech language? And so he and a colleague of his translated the book into the Czech language and put in examples from the Czech Republic. And it's been great. I visited him a number of times in the Czech Republic. We've actually gone on book tours around the Czech Republic.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Talking about it. Actually, the first time we showed up at a university, the professor there was very hesitant. He wasn't sure the students would really be interested in coming and hearing about this new field of conservation biology. And in fact, we went and the auditorium was packed. All the students voluntarily wanted to hear about conservation biology, and we sold out all the books that we brought with us.
Oh, this is wonderful.
Really hungry for conservation biology.
Yes, that's excellent. Anything else on that before we get into the nature of conservation biology training then? Okay.
Well, again, this is the Chinese edition. So,
and notice that they're making them paperback and lighter. This is a load for your backpack.
That's right. So that's been a very big concern. So
saves paper.
We try to make these as inexpensive as possible. So again, it's very thin paper. It's a paperback edition. One thing which I also want to mention is that my publisher is a very public-spirited publisher. It's Sinauer. So Sinauer is a Massachusetts publisher.
Yes.
And so Sinauer just has this attitude that particularly for small countries like the Czech Republic or developing countries like China, that if they can't afford to pay for the royalties to Sinauer just gives them the royalties for free. And we do so that there's no transfer of money between countries. So these editions, these foreign language editions, can be sold for very, very inexpensively in the country so people can afford them.
That's a very great idea. That's wonderful. Okay, anything else on that you want to tell us about the book part of it, this is, I just want to underscore that this is a very, very globalist kind of approach to publishing these, to textbooks. And you mentioned this is like a rather new field. People have been conservationists for a long time, but things are developing in a different way. How would young people looking at this field, what do they need to know? What kind of training do they get in this case? First of all, they use our fun textbooks here.
That's right.
But what kind of training do they need? So many things are interdisciplinary now.
Well, I think that's for training. I mean, a lot of this, actually some of the students here tonight are from Belmont High studying environmental science, and this is obviously a good beginning to sort of learn the science of ecology, environmental science, conservation biology. But one of the things which I think is so important is that if you want to protect the environment, you have to know the environment. And I think that that's something that students really need to really be aware of, that you need to want to be outside and learn to recognize the trees and the shrubs and the wildflowers. You need to be interested in bird watching. You need to be interested in the insects. You need to know a lot about nature if you want to protect it. It isn't all just sort of book learning and things you learn in the classroom. It's very important that you do it by yourself. That's actually what Thoreau did. So Thoreau spent 4 hours a day, every day, walking around, learning about the environment. So you can take classes, you can go on organized field courses. That's a great way to learn, but learning on your own is also great. So there's a lot of ways of doing this by looking at field guides. We have great field guides for New England and for the United States, field guides to all the different kinds of organisms. And the other thing which is really a great opportunity in New England, which is one of the reasons why New England has so many great naturalists, is that we have so many clubs in the Boston area, which really makes it easy. So
even butterfly clubs.
Exactly. There actually is even a Massachusetts Butterfly Club, which has 100 members. There's a Cambridge Entomological Club, the Nuttall Ornithological Club, also lots of bird clubs, plant clubs, fungus clubs. There's all the clubs you could imagine. Actually, the Fungus Club, you're laughing, but the Fungus Club is extraordinarily active. Actually, we're members of it, and it's a very, very active club. So there are all these clubs where you can learn to recognize these things and go out with like-minded people, often who are amateurs, who are just doing it as enthusiastic individuals. And so that's really the way to learn about the environment. It isn't just by reading books.
Right. The other part of that, it sounds like this is a field where a lot of just ordinary people can get involved, can contribute something, can alert you to some kinds of changes that you can't see everything. But it's a very good citizen science kind of an area too,
that's right. So right now we're in kind of a huge development of science where professional scientists are linking up with citizen science groups or with these kind of amateur clubs or very enthusiastic naturalist clubs. So for example, we're working with the Massachusetts Butterfly Club, and we're analyzing all of their records from the perspective of climate change. And this is great for us because we have access to this enormous data set gathered by 100 people over the last 30 years. And they are in turn very enthusiastic about working with our group at Boston University because we're giving them very modern climate change interpretation to a lot of the records that they've been gathering. So it's really very synergistic.
Right. And one more thing, and then I'd like to turn it over to the audience. In terms of gathering data, you have been talking about like taking notes, basically, which is what we think of with Thoreau and these old farmers that used to note the changes in seasons and so on. But in fact, out there in Concord, you have a very sophisticated system, am I right, with the sky and ground. And I urge people to take a look. I believe there's a little video on your website about this, but that you get satellite data and ground data. Just quickly tell us about this, why this very two-way kind of data.
Well, the kind of data which we've been gathering from Concord has the great advantage that we really know the species on the ground today and what they're doing today, but in Concord. And we also have this historical record going back 150 years. But what we don't have is the ability to look all across the entire town of Concord because it's pretty big. It's about 5 or 6 miles across. And also we don't have this ability to look over larger areas. So relating what's happening in Concord to what's happening around New England or even around the United States. And it turns out that there are scientists who only have this big perspective. So these are people who use satellites and remote sensing to determine when plants leaf out in the spring, when they reach full canopy cover, how much leaf area there is in a forest, and also when those leaves senesce or die in the autumn. And these people who do remote sensing, and who often are funded by NASA, are incredibly hungry for on-the-ground truthing of what they're doing. So they have all this incredible imagery, but they often don't know what's happening on the ground.
Yeah.
And so, beginning over the last 2 years, I've been linking up with people who do remote sensing work at Boston University, and they have all these different projects, but they don't have the ground truthing. And so what I propose doing is linking up with what they're doing with what we're doing, and to basically to provide the validation for each other for our own studies.
That makes a lot of sense probably with other kinds of ecosystems as well, back to the tropics and the Arctic region and so on. These that would be very, very useful. Maybe it's in place.
That's right. It's extremely useful because what we're finding, for example, in the high Arctic, that a lot of the plants are now leafing out earlier, much earlier than the past because of warming conditions, but also because it's warmer. They're also growing a lot more, and it means they're absorbing more carbon dioxide. So remote sensing is extraordinarily important, particularly at high latitudes, but also in the tropics. But again, what these people who are doing remote sensing, they're sitting in a laboratory, and they're sitting in front of these powerful computers with these gigantic...
They've never seen a leaf.
But they often don't know what the plants look on the ground. They go there, sometimes they go there very briefly just to see quickly what's going on. But people like myself, know the plants on the ground, and we can provide really a very great interaction if we can manage to speak the same language. That's one of the challenges. Is that the language that we speak is so different from the language that they speak that you actually have to sit for hours just learning to actually speak the same language.
Exactly. That's a very good point, actually, because it's all this interdisciplinary trend across all sciences. This is the #1 problem, just communicating.
It also represents a kind of a major trend in science, which is very different from the humanities, which is that scientists create these collaborative teams very readily. It's a feature of modern science that if you want to do remote sensing, you often don't learn the techniques of remote sensing, but you bring in a colleague into your research project.
Right, and it makes it much easier. I'm going to we have high school students with us tonight. I know they're anxious to ask questions, and I'd let you have some time with the audience here. I thank you very much. We'll be recording as much of this as we can, but I'd like to turn it over now to questions and answers, and thank you very much for joining us at this time.
Thank you for having me.
And I'll just sort of withdraw here and let you take questions.
You said that in local plant life you noticed 10 to 14 days change in some of the leaf outs or in the flowering. What would be some of the plant life that you noticed the greatest change in, some things that we may have heard of, some of the plants that we may know about from the local area?
That's right. So one example is the high-bush blueberry, which is very common. That was one of Thoreau's favorite plants, and that plant has actually shifted about 6 weeks earlier than it did in Thoreau's time. So that's kind of an enormous change. Or marsh marigolds, which is a kind of buttercup which occurs in very wet, swampy areas, has again shifted tremendously. So these are two examples. The species which I'm really talking about, though, are really the species that flower in the spring. So species that flower in the summertime or the very late summer really haven't changed at all. So they're responding much more to day length or precipitation. It's really the species that flower early in the spring that are really responding to temperature. And we particularly like to have questions from high school students.
Are we shy? Well, we'll just let the grown-ups do it then.
Is it possible that, it is possible that this has gone on before in evolution, and so now we've got people with finite tools and people looking at it, but it is possible that this has happened before and it could be a cycle? Is that a true observation, or?
Well, we've had cycles of cooling and warming which have occurred many times over the last 2 million years. But this warming which we're experiencing right now is different from the others because it's happening much more rapidly than warming ever occurred after one of the glacial periods. Yeah, so it's happening faster, so it's not clear that species are really going to be able to adapt to it. There's also a lot of roads and power lines and farms and other human activities which are sort of in the way of species migrating and adapting to the climate change. And also, we have not only warming temperatures, but we also have higher carbon dioxide levels, acid rain, invasive species, a lot of things which are also threatening species at the same time. Yes?
I think it's fair to say that our generation wants to do, as high school students, we want to make the largest impact we can on this movement. What are the opportunities for high school students, even if it's a small impact?
Well, I think the impacts are, or the thing that you can do is to just think about all the things that you can do to minimize the production of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And again, it involves, for example, walking home rather than calling your parents to pick you up, or turning down the thermostat during the winter time, particularly if there's nobody home, but even if there are people at home. So in our home, for example, we keep the temperature between 60 and 62 degrees, and we just put on sweaters, and we sort of get used to it being cool. The only time we turn it above that is when we're having friends of ours over our house who might be too surprised by the cold temperature. So these are the kinds of things that you can do. You can not buy bottled water. You can just use water from the tap, which is actually better quality than bottled water. You can have a simpler diet, so eat less meat and things like that, which would make you healthier and also result in less production of less use of fuel to produce your food. So these are the kinds of things. And the other thing you can do is to request the political leaders to address this question and to have a policy in the United States which winds up using less fossil fuels in the United States.
I saw an article in Science that suggested that while the ice cover in the Arctic is receding, the ice cover in the Antarctic is increasing. So my question to you is, are the plants and whatnot in the southern hemisphere doing exactly what you say you're seeing in the northern hemisphere? Are they moving towards the South Pole?
Well, there's much less information available from the southern hemisphere. So I mean, if you think about the fact of where you have scientific communities, in North America and in Europe, it's a very, very well-developed sort of scientific community. But even, I think there are studies from, for example, Australia and South Africa showing that plants are now flowering earlier in the spring. So even those areas are getting warmer and the plant species are responding. And in regard to the specific study of kind of increased snow cover, ice cover in areas of Antarctic, you can always find one place in the world where things are getting colder or there's more ice cover, but that doesn't take away from what is really a very, very general trend. So if you look across the world, the conditions are getting warmer. Across the world, the average ice cover is getting less, but there's always going to be one place in the world where it's getting colder. And that doesn't to take away from a general trend. It means that there are so many weather stations and there are so many places we can look in the world. So in the United States, I mean, every year there's going to be some place in the United States which gets record cold. But it doesn't mean the United States is getting colder. It just means that in that one particular place it's getting colder, even though most other places are getting warmer.
Except that Antarctica is relatively large, if you will. It's
But
a large exception.
Well, I think that I have to kind of read the specific study, but I think that study is from one specific place in the Antarctic. It's not from the whole Antarctic, it's just from one particular place.
Because the shelves are melting.
That's right. I think in general the shelves are melting in Arctic. I think there's just
on.
one particular place where it's getting larger.
Right.
And then you contrast that with just the enormous melting of ice sheets in the Arctic and in Greenland.
Right.
We're going to have a Northwest Passage pretty soon.
That's right. We're going to get a Northwest Passage. A great opportunity to make money.
Yep.
Drill for oil.
Question from the teacher's perspective. I know you mentioned your textbooks and about how some of them have the local, kind of from the different countries, the different local attachments or pieces to it. Is there one that has a local or a piece to it from Massachusetts, from all the studies that you've done in Massachusetts?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, at what point can you start creating locally adapted editions? And I think that from kind of a publisher's perspective, it isn't worth it to do that. So it would be too expensive to create local content. But what I always tell people is don't just read my textbook and that's all. You should always be combining that with things that you think are interesting. So if your students are interested, so if you're in Massachusetts, have Massachusetts content, or if your students are interested in marine biology, have the students read papers from the popular press or from the scientific journals about marine biology. So always combine that with something that makes your course more tailored to the students and the place where you're teaching your course.
There's back.
Oh, yes?
Where are some places that you can go in Massachusetts where you can sort of like get in touch with nature and stuff? Like what would you recommend?
Oh, there's just so many places. That's one thing which is so wonderful about Massachusetts. There are many places in the country where you just go out of a city and you're immediately in kind of farm country that you can't walk around into, or ranch country, or it's too hot. But Massachusetts is great because of the collapse of agriculture 150 years ago. You go outside of the city and you just go into forest and lots of public land. But in Belmont, for example, if I was living in Belmont, I would go to this place, I can't remember the name of it, what is it called? Rock Meadow. So Rock Meadow, just a short distance from here, is this wonderful kind of place where actually I did research about 20 years ago. Also, you go to Mount Auburn Cemetery, which is very close by, which is one of the best places for bird watching in the country. It has this fabulous density of birds, high density of birds, but you also can see them very close because you can just walk up on the hills and you're right at treetop for the trees that are planted down in the valleys. So it's a wonderful place to look at birds. Again, I really love going to Concord because in Concord there's just so much public land and there's this kind of interesting mixture of historical buildings and historical places with extensive open areas. So whether you just want to walk to public places or take public transportation or drive or bike there's just so much to see here. It's just inexhaustible in the case of this region.
Have you seen any differences in aquatic ecosystems like lakes or streams?
Very good question. It turns out that there's an enormous body of information about when ice out occurs, when the ice forms, but particularly when ice out occurs in the spring in Massachusetts and in New England. And actually there's a group at the U.S. Geological Service that's done an analysis of these data sets. Actually, one of the oldest ones is from Ponkapog Bog in the Blue Hills Reservation. But also, Thoreau recorded when ice out occurred at Walden Pond. And one of my most famous kind of passages, one passage of his that I really liked is at one point in the middle of March, he went out to Walden Pond in the 1850s, and he dug a hole through the ice, and he measured the thickness of the ice of being 27 inches thick. And if you went out this last spring that we just passed, and you went out in the middle of March, you would discover that there was actually no ice at all on Walden Pond because we just went through one of the warmest or the mildest winters ever on record. So we don't have very much information about the effects of climate change on the biology of these habitats, but we have a lot of information on ice out time, and ice out times have gotten dramatically earlier. So again, in Thoreau's time, ice out occurred at the end of March, and now on average the ice out occurs in the middle of March. So the ice out is 2 weeks earlier now at Walden Pond than in Thoreau's time. And this year, ice out occurred at the end of January.
It's also freezing quite a bit later, too.
That's right. So actually this year Walden Pond froze the first week of January. So, I mean, just unbelievable.
So pond hockey is really in trouble.
That's right. Actually, one of the things which was very interesting this year was that it became very popular for people to establish these sort of town rinks where people put these like boards around and were tending to flood them with water. So in Newton Center, for example, where I live, right in the town green, they put these boards out with the idea of sort of flooding it and creating a little children's skating rink in the middle of the town commons in Newton Center. But this is true throughout the Boston area. And they never filled it because it never actually got cold enough this year.
It's quite something. Okay. Anything else, people? Questions? Okay, please, you can stay and talk with him for a few minutes and we'll close down here. But thank you so much, Dr. Primack, and we really appreciate your coming. You can just go ahead and talk with people informally.